Season 8 is almost here, and even though Rick's backstory is mostly covered, there are still a lot of things to uncover about his past, but the least amount of information that we have is about his previous partner before Morty. The only thing we do know about him is his name. Kyle. The very first time when we heard about him was in the first episode of the 5th season. In that episode, Mr. Nimbus remarks, in reference to Morty, that he liked Rick's other one, Kyle, more.
I liked your other one more. What was his name? Kyle?
Morty starts to inquire, but is brushed aside by Rick. This wasn't the only time when he was mentioned in that season. In the 9th episode of the same season, one of the options on Rick's Wheel of Better Things Than Morty is Kyle 2.0, which most likely is the reference to the same Kyle which Mr. Nimbus mentioned in the first episode of the season. This seems to be the only information that we have about him, but there are a lot of hints and references that we can base our assumptions on. First, there is already a character named Kyle in the series. He appeared in the 6th episode of the 2nd season. There are people who think that Rick's first partner could be him because they have the same name. However, I do not think this makes any sense. In the very same episode where he appeared, Kyle fell into a big existential crisis about how he was a puppet in the microverse worlds Rick made, so Rick isn't referring to him. Plus, Morty knew that Kyle too. Therefore, this Kyle has to be someone with a special bond and intrinsic value, who had some kind of backstory with Rick, and we've met a similar character in season 5. In the 9th episode of the 5th season, we are introduced to a character named Nick. Nick was a mentally deranged, insane asylum patient who was committed sometime after attempting to steal Rick's portal gun. While attempting to steal Rick's portal gun, Nick accidentally spilled some portal fluid on himself, leaving him with a permanent portal on his thigh. He's a very interesting person. He knows too much about Rick for a person who met him only once. This scene makes a lot of people think that they had more history than just one bar drinking night. Also, based on his mental asylum and how he gets treated there, Nick could be a reference to Sarah Connor. So is Kyle a reference to Kyle Reese? Both Sarah Connor and Kyle Reese have a common enemy, someone born out of technology. Plus, time travel is a very huge part of the Terminator series, so maybe the reason why Rick hates it is actually somehow related to Kyle and his disappearance. Rick and Kyle could have gone to the adventure, which involved time traveling, which in the end was fatal for the duo and got Kyle killed in the end. There's also a possibility that Kyle being the son of Rick who used to be his sidekick at the beginning of his journey, but it doesn't make sense timeline-wise because we can see that Rick started his sci-fi journeys after the death of his wife and kid, and I don't think he would make a human child with another woman other than Diane. Kyle being his son is also debunked by Mr. Nimbus, since he seemingly knows Rick longer than any other person, maybe besides Diane. Mr. Nimbus has his own comic issue named Rick and Morty Presents Mr. Nimbus, which is about the past of Rick and Nimbus, how they first met, and why they became enemies even though they started as friends. I was hopeful that we would learn at least something about Kyle from that comic, but unfortunately he does not make an appearance there, not even a mention, and from that comic we can see that at the beginning of his journey, or at least by the time he meets Mr. Nimbus for the first time, Rick does not have any sidekick. However, the biggest hint that Kyle might actually be Rick's son comes from the same episode that he's first mentioned in. As I said earlier, Nimbus is the one who name drops him, but Kyle was not the only important character that he mentions from that episode, but Diane as well. The fact that Nimbus name drops both of them in the same episode could be a hint of the possible connection between Diane and Kyle. Maybe Kyle was Diane or Rick's nephew, a younger relative. From the game Pocket Mortys, the scientist known as Rick talks about how he heard that Rick's mother was never satisfied by any actions of him or those of his siblings. We never hear about Rick's extended family, we just heard from that game. Which, by the way, it's canon that he used to have siblings. Maybe he took one of his nephews as a partner who unfortunately died during one of Rick's adventures. His sibling most likely blames Rick for Kyle's death, which could be the reason why they decide to distance themselves and why none of the relatives appear in the show, even though Jerry's parents have made several appearances in the show already. There is a possibility that Kyle was actually Beth's son. In the Rick Mirai Jack episode, we learned that Ricks across the multiverse breed Jerry and Beth in order to create Mortys, since Morty's brainwaves serve as an effective shield for Ricks. However, this doesn't mean that every Beth ends up with Jerry and gives birth to Morty. For example, in the Morty Night Run episode, we learn about an alternate timeline where Jerry and Beth divorced and Beth later remarried Paul Fleischman. This suggests that while in the majority of timelines Beth and Jerry do end up together, there are still timelines where they don't, especially considering that Rick's relationships with Nimbus and Kyle seemingly predate the creation of the Citadel and his plan to force Jerry and Beth together. The most logical assumption about Kyle could be that he is from a dimension where Beth didn't marry Jerry but instead married someone better, someone who treated her well and wasn't a deadbeat. that Beth didn't have a Morty but instead had Kyle. This Kyle might have been killed on an adventure and, as a rarity, was irreplaceable. So Beth cut off all contact, and Rick was forced to abandon that dimension and use a Morty instead, who is proven to be rather indestructible. That's why Rick is extra pissed at Jerry for ruining Beth's life, because she had a better one without him. Rick even makes a remark about Jerry's genes in an earlier episode.
She was Rick's daughter, Jerry. She had options.
Another person I believe knows about Kyle besides Mr. Nimbus is Bird Person. He is Rick's best friend and seemingly knows a lot about him. In the 5th episode of Season 2, Morty is teleported into Bird Person's universe. On Bird Person's wall, we can see a picture of a young Rick Sanchez holding a baby. For a long time, many of us logically assumed the baby was Morty, but after the events of the Season 5 finale, that doesn't really make any sense. Our Rick never had Morty. He only appeared in Morty's life when Morty was already grown up. The Rick in the photo also looks significantly younger than the one who later reconnected with Beth. This leads me to believe that the baby Rick is holding is Kyle, not Morty. Bird Person knowing about Kyle wouldn't be surprising since Rick considers him one of his closest friends and would likely share such a traumatic experience with him. You could argue that Kyle might just be a random character Rick met during one of his adventures like Mr. Nimbus or Bird Person, but I don't think that's the case. His name is Kyle, a very Earth-like name. Every non-human Rick meets on his adventures usually has a very alien-sounding name, which makes me believe Kyle was, at the very least, human. So what could be the current situation with Kyle? Well, the fact that we see Kyle 2.0 on Rick's wheel suggests that at some point Rick tried to revive or clone Kyle. However, it likely went horribly wrong, which could be the reason why Rick no longer mentions him. Still, even the failed Kyle clone was likely a better partner than Morty. Maybe Kyle will reappear in a future episode. He'd most likely be in his 20s or even 30s by now. It would be cool to see him reunite with Rick, if he's alive in the first place. It could make for a really funny episode, especially seeing how jealous Morty might get when Rick hangs out with his old partner. Talking about Kyle turned out to be very interesting for me, and I really hope we learn more about him sooner or later. I'm honestly surprised we didn't see him in Rick's backstory, especially since the clip seemed to cover nearly all of Rick's life. Excluding such an important character feels suspicious. It's not like Kyle was introduced after that backstory clip. He debuted in the same season and was even mentioned in an episode before the backstory scene. All of this makes me wonder why Kyle wasn't shown. It leads me to believe that Rick purposefully excluded him from his memories so Morty wouldn't learn about him yet. The time will come when Rick tells Morty the truth, but that moment hasn't arrived. All of this only adds to the mystery surrounding Kyle's character, and I truly hope we get more answers about him. What do you think about Kyle? Who was he? Rick's first son before Beth? Morty's older brother? Or just another one of Rick's random companions like Mr. Nimbus or a Bird Person? Let me know in the comments.